and the issues around culture change and aspects that come with that. But a second issue around that is the purposes of planning. And it's interesting that we've had the discussion about house building and the way in which neighbourhood plans could potentially contribute to that. And that's about seeing planning as a way of getting numbers involved, getting numbers delivered, about planning and growth, if you like to say. And this is taken from one of our first, the area in red you can see there is going to be a community land trust. So we can see things happening, I suppose, in a way in which neighbourhood planning is involving communities, but we're getting a different kind of delivery. And what's happening on the ground is not just about numbers, but it's about the quality of development, it's about who owns and controls it. So I just want to end as well by thinking about if we're looking forward, what potential scenarios are there for neighbourhood planning? And I've just thought of three. I'm sure there are potentially more. But I think one of these, it's like it carries on as it is. It carries on growing at the rate that it is. It becomes maybe a major part of the planning system, and that may itself be a problem because it becomes mainstreamed, it becomes routinized, and maybe it becomes more connected with a particular kind of area, higher growth areas, a particular type of planning. The second is that it withers on the vine, that some of the difficulties with neighbourhood planning, I'm sure the other panellists will talk about, actually potentially put people off. Groups that have started don't finish their plans, others don't come forward because they don't see it as necessarily delivering what they want to do in the long term. And the third version is that becomes this vehicle for a renewed and possibly a more positive form of planning that we can link with these other community rights that are promoted to the Localism Act and other things that we can bring in, other sources of funding, and that it's about changing planning cultures. It maybe becomes more geographically widespread as well. So I suppose, as well as a critical enthusiast, like you could call me a cynical optimist, and I think you probably know which sort of route I think is a good way for neighbourhood planning to go. But it'll be very interesting to hear other views from the panel about these and other future potential scenarios. So I'm going to hand over to Gavin now, who's going to...
There are, it's a rolling feast this. Every time I speak about neighbourhood planning, of course, the stats and numbers have changed. But we looked at examinations when around about 270 had taken place. And we also did a more detailed look at about 200, 203 plans and the outcomes of examination. All but one required modification by the examiner, and the majority required what we termed major modifications. Some of those major modifications including almost total kind of rewrites through to deletion of single policies, and even in one or two occasions an examiner asking for new policies to be added in. Okay, so a real diversity of approaches and some quite interesting points about how neighbourhood plans that have gone through a process whereby in other research we found that the majority, if not the vast majority, of those plans were having support and input by private sector consultants, and indeed latterly there have been health check processes introduced as well, but plans still seem to be finding their way through to examination and have certain weaknesses, some of them more superficial, some of them fundamental, some of them to do with understanding of process and the scope and the locus, if you like, for neighbourhood planning, others for a range of other reasons. We're currently surveying all of the examiners who...
Programs for students of spatial planning, where students and neighbourhood forum come together, and students do a piece of work, more often an evidence-based research, or occasionally an opportunity study and a policy proposal. So the first page of these handouts is really listing the work we've done, and it's sort of also summarizing in my answer to the first question, or what I see for the first question. So what is being delivered on the ground, what is emerging on the ground. And my perspective is strictly from London, so you might think this is biased or inappropriate. So first of all, a diversity of types of forums, and the other slides, which are all box plots, in a way the size of the box plots is sort of representing also those internal diversities. But also different types of forums where they come from, whether they were a history of active community groups, active in planning, or community groups that were active but not in planning, so they have to learn about planning, or some kind of busy individuals who then find themselves in the position to lead a neighborhood forum and a neighborhood plan. And happen when they die, and who's going to give more money? We're going to get every 5 years about £10,000 for each neighborhood forum to redo their plans, or are they just letting them disappear into thin air? So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to sort of follow this sort of enthusiast, critical enthusiast? Yes. But I'm going to start with enthusiast and then move to the critical in my sort of very short commentary, basically. So to start with enthusiast, I think neighborhood planning has a unique place in the history of our planning system, because for the first time in its history, communities have been given a statutory power to plan for their area and to shape its future. And in the last 5 years, since it started, we've seen high levels of enthusiasm from people, we've seen a lot of community self-organization, and we've seen different forms of democratic experimentation across the neighborhood planning areas. So as a progressive agenda, neighborhood planning has the potential to enhance civic engagement. It has the potential to enhance social innovation, partly because it encourages new ways of knowing and doing planning. But, so I'm going to move to the critical. But these progressive potentials can be seriously undermined by, let's call it, unintended consequences. Although sometimes unintended are known, and we can avoid them. But let's call them unintended consequences. Neighborhood planning and localism in general can lead to fragmentation of decision-making into disjointed practices. It can lead to narrow local self-interest to be prioritized above the interest of the society as a whole. I think John was sort of referring to that earlier. It can generate inward-looking and defensive places. But I'm not going to talk about any of those, because importantly, it can also widen the equity gap between the most and the least deprived communities. And I think that is exactly what has been happening so far. The uneven social geography of engagement in neighborhood planning has been biased towards parish areas, rural communities, and the least deprived socioeconomic groups. Right at the beginning, we started doing some analysis of where neighborhood planning is happening and mapping them against the index of multiple deprivation. And we found that by the end of 2015, out of about 91 plans that were made, i.e. past the referendum stage, only 5 were in the 30% most deprived areas in England. But Gavin has now done much more up-to-date analysis on these figures, and I've gone into various other aspects of it. The paper that he and his colleagues have written will come out, and we will all see it and enjoy reading it. But what Gavin's sort of more recent and more up-to-date analysis has shown, that it has actually confirmed the trend that we were sort of experiencing and observing over the years. It has shown that what they've done, they've set the cohort of about 1,908 designated areas against the index of multiple deprivation, and shown that only 23% of them are in the two most deprived quintiles of the IMD. So you can see that, I mean, as somebody said earlier, these figures are sort of moving targets. They're changing all the time. But what is not changing, the brute fact that the majority of these designated areas are in the least deprived neighborhoods. And of the 245 neighborhood plans that passed referendum by October 2016, which is your analysis is based on, only 6 are in the 20% most deprived areas in England. Again, the majority are in the least deprived. So whichever way we look at this, it appears that the self-selective and voluntary nature of neighborhood planning has created an uneven outcome in favor of the well-off, better educated, and more vocal social groups who have the time, the capacity, and the inclination to engage in neighborhood planning. And surely, and of course there are exceptions, and London that Elena was talking about is the urban area, is the neighborhood forum. The three biases that I mentioned are interrelated, by the way. So surely that is not what neighborhood planning wants to achieve. If neighborhood planning is to be a force for good, if it's going to be a force for widening and deepening civic engagement in planning, which we all want it is very important that it doesn't turn into a vehicle for maintaining and even strengthening established privileges. Or as the CLG Select Committee report of 2014 put it, it should not become the preserve of the rural middle class. So, just to finish, as a planner, I am a planner, I believe that engaging in planning processes is a powerful way of reaching out to those sections of the communities and the society who are increasingly feeling disconnected and being left behind. Quite a lot of them live in where I live, in the north of England, which again, in terms of engagement in neighborhood planning, is much lower than the south of England. So a progressive neighborhood planning has the potential to do so, to create that kind of civic engagement in planning. But only if the right mechanisms are in place to support parity of participation, which we are not witnessing at the moment. And I just want to finish, finally, just to say that what the DCLGs now is appearing to do is a new approach that they are taking, and they are putting the focus on supporting deprived communities to engage in neighborhood planning is a welcome sort of change. And I do hope that this will become a central part of any kind of future of neighborhood planning. Thank you.
John, do you want to take up some of those issues then, support?
Yeah, well, I suppose one thing, it's quite obvious is, one size doesn't fit all. No neighbour plan is the same, no community is the same, no one issue is the same. So it's about understanding exactly what every community requires. And I suppose if we break it down, some people have told me writing a neighbour plan is like writing a piece of fiction, and any good piece of fiction has a beginning, a middle, and the end. So, in terms of the beginning, and I think that's probably what may be missing at the moment, at least in terms of the government support programme, which I fully support and is very good, and it has evolved, but that does follow a statutory roadmap. So it does tend to jump in at when that first statutory step is taken. But I do feel there needs to be a number of stuff at the beginning of this. So I was making some notes just listening today. So we need to ensure that it won't be an aborted plan. I mean, we're talking about what, nearly 3,000 neighbourhood areas designated. That is not going to equate to 3,000 neighbourhood plans. It's not, and we need to understand why that is. So as I say, working with communities who, and I think this is always the first question I ask communities: why are you doing it? Why? So then you can get an understanding of where they're coming from. Is this the right tool for you? Maybe you need to object to a planning application. Maybe you need to engage with the local plan process. Maybe you need to deal with an appeal, get the Secretary of State to call an application in. Getting groups to understand what a neighbourhood plan can achieve, what it can't achieve. Encourage them to collaborate as well. The amount of neighbourhood plans I've seen have commenced because they have a dysfunctional relationship with their local authority and they feel that their neighbourhood plan will be a big stick they can beat them with. That's not going to work. Although I have seen some groups who, through the process, have actually built bridges with their LPA. And I know it sounds corny, but it's almost like the journey was just as important as what the end product was. And also working with groups of how to source help and assistance. As I say, the government programme is very good, but there's only a finite amount of money. And some plans were more ambitious than others. So I think, particularly in deprived areas, community cohesion, community developers, people can go in there. I mean, we talk about rural areas, more plans are going on in rural areas. I mean, it could be quite complicated, it could be more simple, it's easier to designate. Maybe it's the fact that they're wealthier, so they can afford to buy in more support, or they're many retired people, so they have more time in their hands, or maybe more skills. So it's quite complicated, and I think working with groups to help them help themselves is incredibly important. We need to make sure that this isn't going to be a challenge plan. So getting people to understand checks and balances. This is a statutory planning process, and you cannot fudge an SEA. You just can't. You make the plan, it can be challenged. I mean, we've just had Henfield quashed in the High Court due to an inadequate SEA. So they can develop good habits as well, not cutting corners. And also, I think, working with communities at the beginning to ensure it will be a community plan. It's not in the statute books, but as far as I'm concerned, a group shouldn't be coming to me knowing what their plan's going to include. They shouldn't. I mean, for me, it's all about developing a vision for their area. What do they want their community to be? And then out of that, developing objectives, and then the planning policies deliver those objectives. Getting people into good habits, and also true engagement and consultation. I've never really worked with groups who don't want to engage, but they don't necessarily know how to, particularly with hard-to-reach groups. And then again, I'll move on just in terms of, I suppose, moving to the middle. But current support is great. Lots of technical support goes in there, and that absolutely is required. However, I'll echo it again. I think many groups just want critical friend support as well. Just someone they can talk to, they can bounce ideas off. I mean, I suppose one of the main issues with the current support programme is you almost have to know what you want. I mean, there are some good people there who are assessing the groups in terms of their needs, but maybe they could be a bit more ambitious, go a bit further if they can just sit in a room and talk to someone about what their ambitions are. And I think that could help immensely, particularly in deprived areas. And I think just moving on to the end of the process, I mean, there's a few things here. So we need a more robust examination process. I mean, I think the legislation is good. But there is a consistency with examiners that needs to be addressed. I think Gavin's made the point, and he's got the case studies on this. The planning system should give certainty to both decision makers and applicants. I'm not convinced examiner reports are doing that at the moment, and unfortunately, it's being left to the courts on a number of occasions. And Henfield is one, Swanwick is another. For those who don't know Swanwick, it's the only neighbourhood plan to fail referendum. Now, the community who led the no campaign were the people who wrote the plan, because they felt the examiner had amended their plan so much it was no longer what they felt was theirs, so they led the no campaign on that, and that needs to be looked at. And again, and I think what we also need to look at is how we support plans post-making. I mean, government have been great, they've amended the statute books, we can now modify plans in a much more simple way, but I want to work with groups in terms of how do we monitor your planning policies, how do we know they're working, how do we know they're effective, so how you want to modify this, and continuing to engage the wider community. So I think there was a massive role for neighbourhood planning post-making of that plan. Planning does not end when that plan is on the statute books. As far as I'm concerned, that's when the process starts. And I think I've gone through all of my things, but I suppose one thing is probably a bit of a shout out for local planning authorities. I was chatting to someone the other day and I was accosted by a local planning authority officer, and he did tell me, and he would say this I guess, but the best way to support communities is for government to support the local planning authority in terms of giving them resources. Now, I do think LPAs can be very cost effective in terms of the way they can provide support, and I've seen some really interesting uses of LPA support. I mean, one example was, some of you may or may not have heard of the Stamford Hill neighbourhood plan. This was a neighbourhood area designated, 2 rival forums who had very, very different views. Neither would necessarily be representative of the area, and neither forum got designated, and nothing was ever going to happen. But Hackney, to be fair to them, have stepped in. They're using area action plan powers, but they're getting independent consultants in to work with the entire community to develop what is essentially a neighbourhood plan, but through existing LPA-led powers. And yes, it's interventionist, but it was probably required in that particular scenario. But there's no reason why LPAs can't provide that level of support for actual neighbourhood plans, particularly in deprived areas. Some of the best ones I've seen in deprived areas are where neighbourhood plans are linking up with council regeneration schemes. So again, where area action plans are being developed, strategic policies being dealt with by the local authority, the neighbourhood plan group are brought in to put the detail on the bones, and that works very, very well. But then, I suppose, what do I know? I've never written a neighbourhood plan. I'd probably be interested to hear from anyone in the room who is actually going through the process in terms of what they feel they need. Thank you.